Hello there. Welcome to the ACLU of Texas's annual membership meeting. I hope everyone can hear me. My name is Ranjana Natarajan. I am chair of the board of directors of the ACLU of Texas. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm coming to you live from Austin. So this is our first hybrid, both in-person and virtual annual meeting since the pandemic began, but we're really happy to be able to gather together. We have people tuning in from all over the state, as well as folks who are joining us live in Houston. They are at SESH, which is a co-working space for women and genderqueer people that fosters community through collaboration, learning, and advocacy. We're really happy to have you here, whether you're here virtually or in person. Thanks for joining us. I also want to thank you, give out a big thank you to our contributing members in Houston and online. We are grateful for your partnership today and every day, and your important financial contributions are critical to us in helping support all the work you will be hearing about tonight. And of course, a special thanks to the staff of the ACLU of Texas who are with us this evening from all over the state and who are going to give us a lot of great updates and knowledge on the breadth and depth of the work that they're doing and that the ACLU of Texas is doing all around the state. And as you know, as supporters and members of the ACLU of Texas, we work on a lot of issues: free speech and pluralism, border and immigrants' rights, LGBTQIA plus equality, reproductive freedom, smart justice and accountability, and voting rights and democracy. I've early voted. I hope that you have too. And if you haven't, go vote. There's still plenty of time. So this evening, we're going to have a packed panel with many of the individuals who are working on the front lines for the ACLU of Texas. You're going to hear some of the challenges we're facing today and the outcomes we're working toward and our vision for Texas. You'll also get a forecast of what we anticipate when the Texas legislature gavels in January for its 88th legislative session. Following our staff updates on the pressing civil rights and civil liberties issues, we will also provide an opportunity for folks to ask questions of our staff panel, and we'll be answering those at the end. If you are tuning in on YouTube, you can ask a question by inserting your question directly in the comments. And of course, if you're in person, there's a mechanism to do that as well. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. And if you're in Houston, we will, of course, take your questions live. So that's a little bit about the program tonight. In addition, I want to take an opportunity to honor a very special board member who left us just days ago, and we are deeply saddened. Paul Osofsky passed away this past Friday evening. He was one of our longest, I think he was our longest serving board member and a true force for change. He was really not only a supporter, but a leader at the ACLU of Texas. And it is no overstatement to say that he really guided the mission of this organization for a very long time. So we're so grateful for his steadfast support of the ACLU of Texas and his lifelong commitment to protecting civil rights and civil liberties in Texas. Excuse me for a second. Paul, we know you're here with us in spirit. We are grateful for your years of visionary leadership and service. So next up, I would like to introduce Ani Blair, the Executive Director of the ACLU of Texas, who is live in Houston. Ani joined us in June of 2021, and in just the first year, she has already shown us her visionary leadership. Many of you have gotten to meet her virtually or in her travels over the state in the last year, and I'm excited to start the conversation tonight with Ani. Ani, tell us a little bit about what you've been up to over the past year here in Texas. And I'm sure you've voted already, haven't you?
Thank you, Ranjana. We have been busy, and yes, I voted yesterday. If anyone tuning in tonight hasn't voted yet, please plan to be a voter. Early election voting ends tomorrow, Friday, and election day is Tuesday, November 8th. If there's one theme for this evening, that's it: vote. When we hear from staff and our staff panels today, you'll understand why that's so important and why that's our theme. For our members and supporters who've joined us this evening, welcome, and thank you for your support of the ACLU of Texas. Your support is critical. I'm Ani Blair, and I'm the Executive Director of the ACLU of Texas. I use she, her, and aya pronouns. Ranjana, let me say this. There's no reason to sugarcoat anything tonight. I want to be very clear. We face major ongoing attacks on our civil rights and civil liberties across the state. Abortion is banned. Trans youth and their families face attacks and face family separation. Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC voters are also under attack, consistently intimidated, threatened with prosecution, or even purged from voter rolls. Asylum seekers can't seek an asylum hearing, an immigration hearing, or a safe place to stay while they wait for one. Prisons are filled with people who simply can't afford bail. And school libraries and classroom books involving BIPOC, Jewish, LGBTQIA persons are banned, removed from bookshelves in our schools. If you want to change this, you change this by electing people who care about these issues and will change it. That's why your vote is so important. That's why your vote during the midterm elections and every elections matter. And that's why your support of the ACLU of Texas matters. The state's direct attacks on our rights calls for the ACLU to show up and to be present and to do all that we can to fight these attacks. We stand ready to meet them, and we are ready, as you'll hear more about tonight. The faces of power behind these attacks, the governor, the lieutenant governor, the attorney general, even the locally elected school boards, their actions directly impact the lives of Texans, our lives. And the same people, Texans all around us, everyday people, are powerfully speaking up and taking action to make Texas a better place for everyone. For example, as I mentioned earlier, books are banned and book censorship has become a true challenge in our schools. Students are facing a litany of harms in their education, mental health, and the future that they face here in Texas. Yet students, educators, and parents are standing up and fighting back, creating space for young people to show how they can be a part of change here in Texas. So before we start our discussions with our staff and panels here this evening, I want to share a compilation of videos directly from students where they are sharing how they are looking at the environment here in Texas and what they plan to do about it.
Place in my heart.
One which stands out to me, the book Fahrenheit 451 by the author Ray Bradbury.
A book I feel represented by is We Are Not Like Them by Christine Pride and Joe Piazza.
This book, titled Cemetery Boys by Aiden Thomas, really made me feel seen as a Mexican American who is part of the LGBTQ community.
When I read Flamer by Mike Curato, I saw myself in the protagonist.
One book I read that's made me feel represented is Hani and Ishu's Guide to Fake Dating.
Rick Riordan's books hold a level of diversity that I'm so glad to have grown up reading.
There's two bisexual women of color in there.
Yadriel, the main character of the book, is a transgender boy.
Nico D'Angelo was the first gay character that I ever read about.
I really think that matters because I really don't see that portrayed in other books. Reading books that center stories around people like me that have identities like me helps me feel safe, seen, and valued.
All schools should try teaching more about LGBTQ history.
It matters that queer youth see themselves in the books they read, not only in their leisure time, but also in the classroom, in their school libraries.
Books of all sorts are being banned from being accessed in our educational institutions.
We need to make sure that we're creating schools that embrace, celebrate, and advocate for the diversity on their campus.
We must support educators in a diverse educational experience.
Nico's struggles to accept his sexuality are universal and need to be talked about more in young adult literature, not banned.
This is the perfect segue into our first topic for the evening on free speech and pluralism. I'll be joined by Staff Attorney Kate Huddleston, along with Senior Government Affairs Manager Matt Simpson, who will share a little bit more about the environment in Texas, what's happening on free speech and in our schools, and what we see coming ahead. Kate, Matt?
Thanks, Ani. My name is Kate Huddleston. I am a staff attorney in our Houston office, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm here to talk with you, along with my colleague Matt, about free speech and pluralism. What this means when we think about working toward a society with free speech and pluralism is basically a society that is inclusive, in which everyone has a voice and everyone can fully participate and be comfortable being themselves. Unfortunately, that's not what we have in Texas right now. We are facing in our schools in particular attacks on inclusive education that an effort by state and local leaders in many places to restrict the number of ideas and the sense of belonging that people have, and to make white Christian nationalism dominant in our society. So we are fighting back against that. What we want is an actively inclusive Texas that welcomes and celebrates diverse identities, and that actively teaches the history of racism, actively teaches the history of systemic discrimination in our past in order to move toward a better present and future. Schools that provide a safe environment for students to engage in free speech and freedom of expression, and to ensure that free speech and protest are protected for everyone, especially for BIPOC communities. Toward that end, we have a few goals that we have been working toward here, particularly focusing on, for K through 12 schools, ending censorship and securing inclusive education, and protecting the rights of BIPOC and LGBTQIA+ students and educators to express themselves freely in public schools as their authentic selves. We are also working to protect the individual rights of all Texans to free speech and to protest, especially for those who are still fighting to secure the full exercise of their civil rights and liberties. And I'll turn it over to my colleague, Matt Simpson, to talk about what we're doing at the legislature in particular.
Hey, y'all. As Ani kind of already described, we expect this legislative session to be a tough one. Opponents and people that have been attacking civil liberties on the campaign trail throughout their political careers are likely to come back and be in control of the legislature and the governor's house, the governor's mansion. And so with that kind of context, we know that there will likely be a handful of kind of far-right proposals that'll be moving through the legislature. We, of course, are planning to stop those bills. The different categories we expect to see. First of all, we anticipate that there'll be what people like Governor Abbott have been calling a Parents' Bill of Rights. These are attacks on inclusive schools, kind of cast as allowing parents to have a greater say in education. But it is, again, really just an effort to pass the kind of thing we saw like in Florida, the Don't Say Gay, we're binding the hands of teachers so that they can't talk about the real world, essentially. Kind of along with that, or not dissimilar to that, we're concerned that the attacks we're seeing at the school board level, Kate's certainly been trying to address those, we're worried that will be either empowered or even enabled by legislation or by state law through the legislature. This could look like something that would ban CRT in an even more expansive way, critical race theory. It could also ban things like talking about gender fluidity. It would be an even more extreme version of the classroom censorship that frankly, some schools are already engaging in Texas. Another effort or another route to really make schools less inclusive and to really empower those conservative voices would be to empower school boards to have more control over curriculum and over books in the library. So at the moment, the state maintains some amount of control over what curriculums are adopted and is, I think, to a lesser degree, as involved in the books in the library. The legislature could turn that over to local actors, and then we would see, just from community to community, we could see school boards really grappling with this far-right movement to censor what children learn. And then the last piece that we could see, we anticipate seeing, and frankly we're planning to fight against, is banning critical race theory in universities. The Senate in particular, last session and through the interim, senators from our state Senate have talked about wanting to somehow censor what's being taught in universities, which is just as bad an idea as it was for K through 12. So we are, aligning with other groups that work on these issues. We are putting our heads together in our communications in our policy and advocacy department and with our legal colleagues to try to start planning to push back on these bills. I'll stop there and kick it back to Ani.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Matt. As we're thinking about what Kate and Matt presented on free speech and pluralism and the impact that it's having across the state and our schools, I just want to think back to our theme for tonight on voting. We're often concerned about the highest levels of elected officials in our state when we're thinking about voting. Every position on the ballot matters, including those in your school district, your school board races, or state school boards. So remember that all of them are important, and these are the ways that we think about and can change what's happening in our schools. Now let's transition to our work on defending the rights of immigrants and our border communities. Time and again, for the last few months, we've seen so many political stunts by the Texas governor and by the Florida governor, using people seeking asylum as political pawns. I want to turn to Staff Attorney Bernardo Cruz, who will share more about what's happening in this space and the ACLU of Texas's work to defend the rights of immigrants and border communities, and then we'll turn back to Matt for a preview of what will happen in the legislative body. Bernardo.
Thank you, Ani. Bernardo Cruz, pronouns he, him. I'm an attorney based in El Paso. So as Ani was saying, I do want to talk about some of the problems we're seeking to solve around the issue of rights in Texas. This list is not going to be exhaustive, but we have placed them into 3 general buckets. The first one is the harms that are caused by the immigration enforcement by the state of Texas. So currently, unfortunately, the state, spearheaded by Governor Abbott, is seeking to assume what is normally federal immigration enforcement authority. And that's really from what we can see with the intent to expand white nationalism and push false narratives for what are blatant political needs. We've seen some extreme examples, such as the busing of migrants from the state of Texas to other parts of the country, and also for what is being called the Operation Lone Star, which is also this undue use of force against migrants. The second bucket we have are general racial profiling and targeting of immigrants, really arising from the entanglement of local law enforcement with federal immigration enforcement authorities, such as ICE officials. And the third bucket we have is centered on over-policing and the militarization of by CBP and ICE, which are both components of the Department of Homeland Security. So we have these different organizations here that really have caused injury to our communities around the border, for example. Here in El Paso, we've seen car chases by the Border Patrol agents, which result in deaths. And of course, not only in the border, but throughout the whole state, we see really negative conditions in which immigrants are detained throughout the state. We do want to move, of course, to what we think, and we're moving towards what we think our success would look like in these areas. One very important would be to reduce the amount of money that the state of Texas currently spends on immigration enforcement. The second would be getting the department's DPS out of immigration enforcement completely. And in all accounts, trying to push for CBP accountability when there is some type of use of force, be it in some type of action where someone is detained, or when folks are currently detained as well. Have to limit detention and humane treatment of folks in immigration detention completely. This is a broad category, but it does include trying to provide appropriate health care, religious accommodations, and even a periodic review of detention for folks in immigration custody. And the last would be protecting immigrant communities from racial profiling generally. Really here, the ultimate goal or desired outcome is to create a safe space that is also welcoming communities for everyone, including migrants. And just ending with the visionary goals that we're trying to do this. One would be, like I said, ending immigration enforcement by Texas, reducing and ultimately eliminating enforcement of federal laws and militarization by the state of Texas, and pushing back against this militarization of communities, not only across the border, but really throughout all our states. And now I'm going to pass it to colleague Matt, to discuss what to be on the lookout at the Texas State Legislature.
Thanks, Bernardo. Of the items that Bernardo mentioned, of course, they happen at different levels. There's federal, state, and local actors that are engaging in this misbehavior or poor behavior. In the case of session, that'll be an opportunity to really start trying to address state behavior. So the program that the Operation Lone Star, the Governor Abbott has started, it truly involves a lot of different state agencies, all violating civil liberties and civil rights. You've got an arrest and trespass program that is causing racial profiling, and the vehicular pursuits that Bernardo was talking about. They're dangerous car chases because DPS is chasing folks through the Rio Grande Valley and the North Rio Grande Valley. Operation Lone Star is something that we will be working on this session, both trying to reduce the budget. Currently, it's already about $4.4 billion has been spent just on this operation. The state's been spending hundreds of millions and eventually billions since 2005 on border operations, all of which have had very nebulous missions, and at this point is just a pure political stunt. So we will be working both on Operation Lone Star and trying to challenge the budget, the large amount of taxpayer dollars that's going to it, as well as looking for ways to limit the impact it has on local communities, trying to look at ways that we can implement better DPS vehicle pursuit policies, for example. So at least if there are going to be state actors that are engaging in what is essentially inappropriate enforcement, we will have at least some limits on what they're doing and maybe start to push back against this larger operation. The second half of working to address state and in this case, some local efforts to enforce what's clearly federal immigration laws, we will be on the lookout for criminal laws, new criminal laws that are really an effort to enforce immigration laws. So a great example is that the legislature often tries to increase the penalty for certain kinds of trespass. Well, many times that's just a quiet way for them to try to engage in immigration enforcement with the idea that anyone that's trespassing near a border must be someone that is illegally trying to get into the United States. And so we'll be on the lookout. So we kind of will be working in different arenas, right? We'll be engaging with the state budget. We'll be working on ways to limit the state police. We'll be pushing to bring the Texas Military Department home, bring them back from the border so they can do real like emergency missions as they've kind of been designed. And we'll be on the lookout to make sure that new criminal laws aren't passed that are more or less just inviting local and state law enforcement to engage in immigration enforcement. Thanks so much, Ani. I'll kick it back to you.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Bernardo. When we started, I noted the attacks on the LGBTQIA community, and I want to be sure that I don't rush because it's important to include the I and the A. Right now, the attacks are especially horrific and politically motivated against transgender students. I'd like to turn it over to one of our newest team members, our legal fellow, Chloe Kemp, who is going to talk about what we're facing on the horizon and what our high priorities look like in this space. Chloe.
Thank you, Ani. Hi, my name is Chloe Kemp. I'm an attorney and legal fellow, and my pronouns are she and her. As Ani was just saying, there is a lot at stake in this space right now. We are seeing a lot of anti-LGBTQ, but especially anti-transgender rhetoric and misinformation from policymakers and other powerful people. And this rhetoric is coming to fruition as policymakers attempt to make policies that do everything from, as we heard in the free speech and pluralism presentation, attack LGBTQ identities in schools. We're also seeing efforts to restrict access to life-saving gender-affirming care and so much more that we'll get into later. And it's so important that we fight this rhetoric and these policies because they are in direct opposition to our vision of success in Texas, which is to create a state where all identities are welcome, where LGBTQIA people are protected at the state, local, and federal levels, and where access to health care is legal and also acceptable. So to make our vision come true, we have created a few goals. And the first one I want to talk about is our goal to protect and expand transgender Texans' right to be who they are. Like Ani was mentioning, because the attacks against the transgender community are so severe right now, this goal is really top of mind for us. You might have heard about our lawsuits against the governor and DFPS. They're called Doe and PFLAG v. Abbott. And in those lawsuits, we're suing to try to halt investigations of families who are seeking gender-affirming care for their transgender youth. And we also, under this goal, have a wide array of legislative strategies that Matt is going to get into a little bit later. And then finally, our second goal, more broadly, is to protect and expand the rights of all LGBTQIA+ people in Texas. This means preserving rights that the community has already fought hard for, like the right to marriage, like we've been mentioning all night, protecting LGBTQIA students and educators in school. And then, like Ani mentioned, really highlighting voices from all across the LGBTQIA+ spectrum. And so now I'll turn it over to Matt for some highlights about our legislative strategy and what we're expecting.
Thanks, Chloe. Well, this is my third and final time to appear. I appreciate the chance to speak on all this. I'm excited about the work we're doing, even if the subject matter is, frankly, a little terrifying. We are playing a lot of defense in this arena. First off, we want to be sure that we work with allies and champions in the legislature to stop bills that outlaw medical care for trans youth. Last session, this is a concept that legislators toyed with. It's something that far-right politicians talk about in the election cycle. We have to be on guard to make sure that there is a place in our society for trans youth and they're not denied just basic medical care. The second form of attacks that we've seen, particularly in the more conservative Senate, and we'll be on guard for again in 2023, are attacks on gender markers. This means that as you transition, you're not allowed to change your name or your gender on government documents. Clearly, this creates all kinds of issues, including causing government actors to be able to target people because they can be identified. So those will also be on guard for. A third item really connects almost directly to the case that Chloe and our other lawyers have been working on, that we'll be pushing back to make sure that DFPS is not given the authority to investigate families of trans youth as though there's child abuse. This is something that I think probably a lot of folks have probably heard of the litigation around this or heard it talked about in the election cycle. I think that it's not well understood just how awful passing something like a child abuse bill would be. These investigations from DFPS have a totally different criminal standard, and so in many ways they're a more intrusive investigation even than, investigation of crime. And so empowering a state agency to get involved in families' lives so inappropriately would be a huge problem. And it's something that we're communicating with legislators and policymakers to make sure doesn't go through. And then the last piece that we're really playing defense on at the legislature in the LGBTQIA+ space, it really crosses over with some of our pluralism work. We're really concerned that, something like Florida's Don't Say Gay bill will pass and make schools not a non-inclusive place. This is an attempt that the Texas legislature has made in the past. They certainly tried to make it hard for trans youth to play sports last session, for example. And so we're concerned what form that might take again this time. But again, working with our comms team and our legal team to make sure that we're ready to take on these challenges in 2023. And couldn't agree more that I think on tonight's theme, voting is incredibly important, because even if Democrats don't necessarily take statewide offices, the closer that we can get all of this, the closer that we can have the two parties, the less that one party will move away, and it really emboldens our champions to have everyone voting and participating in the system. And so with that, I'll kick it back to you, Ani.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Chloe, for sharing one aspect of our work around sexuality and gender, focused specifically on our LGBTQIA equality and especially on our transgendered students. Next, I'd like to transition over to another part of our work around sexuality and gender, specifically about reproductive rights. The Supreme Court decision on Dobbs versus Jackson ended Roe v. Wade. For many people, they might think that that ended our work, but there's so much work to do, and we're ready for it. So now I'd like to turn it to our policy strategists, Blair Wallace and Staff Attorney David Donati to share what we're doing in multiple spaces across the state.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Ani, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. As Ani said, my name is Blair Wallace. I use she, her pronouns, and I lead our policy and advocacy work for reproductive freedom. To start us off, I'm going to pass it to David to set the current legal landscape around abortion.
Thank you so much, Blair and Ani, and thank you all for coming tonight. My name is David Donati. My pronouns are he, him, and él, and I'm an attorney in the Houston office. As Ani said, the Supreme Court this year overturned the case Roe versus Wade in a decision called Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. That was a challenge to a 15-week abortion ban in Mississippi, which under Roe versus Wade would have been struck down immediately. And in so doing, the Supreme Court made a couple of very troubling findings that we're unfortunately going to continue having to reckon with. One of them is it stated, in contradiction of 50 years of Supreme Court precedent, that there is no constitutional right to an abortion. And it went further to say that any state restriction on the right to abortion is going to be reviewed with the lowest level of scrutiny by the federal courts. So if a state provides almost any basis for restricting abortion or regulating it, the federal courts are instructed by the Supreme Court, as currently constituted, to allow those regulations to go into effect. And of course, another thing to watch out for is the reasoning that the Supreme Court used in striking down Roe versus Wade, of course, touches on a lot of other due process rights that we hold very dear. The reasoning can implicate the right to marriage equality, the right to contraception, even the right to interracial marriage, all of which are founded in a legal concept called substantive due process, that the Supreme Court has long held very sacred, but that this court seems inclined to chip away at. And what that means in Texas is that we now have a legal landscape that prohibits abortion in a couple of ways. The first is something we've been dealing with since last year. Since September of 2021, Senate Bill 8 has been in effect, and that's what we call the bounty hunter law. That allows any person to sue any other person, regardless of location, connection, or injury, for minimum statutory damages of $10,000 in connection with an alleged abortion. And that prohibits any abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy. And then you add on top of that elaborate civil scheme what we've been calling the trigger ban, but which is Texas's criminal prohibition on abortion that makes a provision of an abortion up to a first-degree felony punishable by 99 years in prison. And so the effect of these laws together is that we've seen abortion care shut down in the state of Texas. And I'll pass it back to Blair to talk a little more about that.
Yeah, so now that David has laid this all out, it's pretty clear to see the problems that we're facing in Texas regarding reproductive freedom. As was stated, abortion is currently banned in Texas, meaning that there are no providers providing abortions and no clinics open. We have other access to other reproductive health options under attack. We have criminal justice system tools and processes deployed against providers, families, and communities. And frankly, we're dealing with danger and damage to dignity and bodily autonomy. All of this, we know, disproportionately harms our BIPOC and low-income communities. But I want to talk about what success looks like. I believe that believing in reproductive freedom is the belief in our own destiny of being able to control our own lives and body without government interference. A belief that when people have choices, they make the right ones for their lives. And so, you know, when we think about our goals, and our big goal is for people to have the right to have a child if, when, and how they want, and the right to parent that child in healthy and safe environments. You know, when I think about this work, I think about how it touches literally every aspect of my life as a mother myself. And we have, you know, long fought for the protections that, the protections that Roe gave us were really honestly just a very bare minimum, and we're not going to go back to that. We're not going back to the bare minimum. We're now dreaming bigger. We want to expand rights, not just restore them. But like I said, that's the long term, the big picture. And, luckily we're in the fight for the long term and happy to have you folks along with us. But what about our shorter term goals? First, I want to say that conversations about, abortion and bodily autonomy being normalized is some of the most radical advocacy that we can do. Did you know that anti-abortion advocates say the word abortion 4 times more than pro-abortion advocates? Like I said, some of the most radical advocacy you can partake in is simply talking about abortion. Stigma busting is essential to our big picture goals and something that we're really focused on here at the ACLU. Second, we hope, a part of our shorter term goals is that there are more people at the legislature, at city, county, and commissioners courts advocating for abortion and reproductive health care. If this is something that is interesting to you and something you want to learn more about, consider joining our next cohort of the Texas Abortion Access Network, which begins this January. This training is done in collaboration with many of our Texas reproductive justice partners and gives folks a comprehensive training to be able to use your particular interest and skills to be an advocate for abortion in your community. Once I stop talking, I'll drop the link in the chat for anyone that's interested. And lastly, quite simply, our short-term goal is that abortion is treated as the healthcare that it is. People need access to abortion and other reproductive health options for a lot of reasons, and we have to do everything that we can to ensure patients and doctors are able to make those decisions without considering what someone in Austin is thinking, right? And we know that this is all possible, all of this work is possible because Texans agree with us. Polling that we did recently showed that 9 of 10 Texans don't approve of our current abortion bans, which is why we are doing everything that we can to expand the ways in which we do advocacy. As our lane narrows for abortion rights, we can expand to do other things. We are working on policy at the local, state, and federal level. We are working with doctors and midwives and abortion storytellers and maternal morbidity and mortality experts. We're using all of our networks to connect people to the resources they need because we don't know everything, but we know somebody, right? And so together we can figure this out together. Next, I'm going to pass it back to David to talk about some of the other work that we're doing.
Thank you, Blair. And so one of the things that Blair has been talking about is that the immediate effect of Texas's prohibitions now is that abortion access is shut off in the state of Texas. And one thing that we are putting our eyes towards now is some of the effects that have not yet developed. And so as a result of the prohibitions, it's had a tremendous chilling effect on the provision of abortion. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to receive abortion care in the state of Texas. But what we anticipate and what the state of Texas has intended is to deploy the coercive tools of state power against individuals and communities and families in this space. And what I'm talking about specifically is the power of surveillance and invasion of privacy that is attendant to something like Senate Bill 8 and to the criminal prohibitions in the trigger ban and the pre-Roe versus Wade criminal prohibitions. One thing that we are particularly mindful of is the use of surveillance tools against individuals, families, and communities. The state of Texas has substantially increased its use over the past 5 years or so of what are called reverse warrants. And those are warrants in which they don't particularly suspect you of a crime, but they go out and they use different search techniques to identify people who might fall within a category of suspicious persons. So to make that a little less complicated and more concrete, those can be geofence warrants. And so they go to a place like Google or Apple and they say, we want you to search all of your user data and tell us anybody who is a Google user who visited this abortion clinic, for example. The state of Texas routinely deploys warrants of that nature to Google, and we anticipate seeing something like that in the reproductive justice space. And in response to that, we are working with different stakeholders to prepare a network of ready, willing, able, and well-trained criminal defense attorneys and others to be in place to respond if and when a need arises. It is a difficult place to be because you have to build the network without knowing what the need is going to be. But the risks of criminal prosecution are just too high to wait and see. And so with that, I will pass it back to Blair.
Thank you, David. Yeah, so now that we're, sort of identified what the problem is, we know some things that we're doing in the short term and the goals that we're trying to achieve, we must look immediately ahead to legislative session. Our Texas legislative session starts at the beginning of January. We are just 2 weeks out from bills being filed. So although we don't know exactly what bills are going to be filed, we know some general themes based on other things that have happened in other states and just things that are being said in the media. We know that Texas anti-abortion lawmakers love to come to Texas and make us the front lines for really wild and interesting legislation. So always sitting on the edge of my seat to see what is to come next. But some things that we are sort of looking out for. To start out, we have the National Right to Life, which is an extremist anti-abortion group, has been shopping around a pretty horrifying bill that would allow seemingly endless power granted to the Attorney General to come into jurisdictions that are not prosecuting abortion criminalization charges. It also allows for racketeering charges to be brought against people considered to be considered to be participants in regular abortion activity, whatever that is, among other terrible things. We also are expecting restrictions and perhaps full-out bans on birth control and other emergency contraception. We're also looking at a potential out-of-state travel ban. We have seen legislation filed similar to this in Idaho that was legislation that banned trans youth from leaving the state to access gender-affirming care. Just another example of, legislators trying to restrict people's access to life-saving care. Doesn't make any sense to me. But also we're fighting back. So not only do we have, sort of all of the defensive work that we're going to be doing at the legislative session, we're also working tirelessly with our legislative champions to build proactive policy. And like David said, we're really trying to think about the things we have yet to see and try to be proactive about all of the ways that this new landscape is affecting Texans. So these policies include things like an abortion omnibus bill, an abortion decriminalization bill, and then a bill that's personally near and dear to my heart called Marlisa's Law. Marlisa's Law is a policy that, as I said, is very near to me because I've gotten to know Marlisa's family over my years with the ACLU. What this policy does is it changes the Texas Health and Safety Code to allow pregnant people the same end-of-life care options that every non-pregnant Texan receives. I truly encourage you to look up the story of Marlise Munoz. It's a pretty tragic story, and I will spend my days as an advocate trying to ensure that no one has to go through the things that her or her family went through. This bill is her legacy, and I really hope that this year is the year that we get it passed. I think that her story really displays that people need access to reproductive health care for a million reasons. And frankly, at the ACLU, we will fight for every single one of those reasons. Thank you for standing with us and getting engaged and talking about abortion and being here today. Ani, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Ani. Hi, everybody. My name is Lauren Johnson. I'm a policy advocacy strategist here in Austin, and my pronouns are she and her. And I think I'll kick us off with just wrapping your head around the idea that Texas is the epicenter of the United States mass incarceration crisis. In the highest incarcerated nation on earth, Texas locks up most people of any single state, which kind of, if you want to put it into perspective, makes us the highest incarcerator in the universe. That process begins with arrests, and more than 800,000 people are arrested annually in Texas. On any given day, there are more than 190,000 people locked up in our jails. And at each stage of the criminal justice system, racial disparities are stacking up. Black Texans are only about 12% of our population, but they make up 25% of the people arrested by police. They make up 28% of the people who are shot by police and 31% of the people who are incarcerated. While we're working on a number of criminal justice issues, here are what we view as some of the most important goals during our next legislative session. First, reducing police interactions and arrests. There are a few ways that we could go about this. Two that we'll be working on in the upcoming session are continuing to push decriminalization of marijuana and eliminating arrests for fine-only offenses, which is the last component of the long-awaited Sandra Bland Act, because if she had not been arrested for a fine-only offense, she would still be alive today. Both of these reforms enjoy bipartisan support, and together they would reduce annual arrests by around 15%. And then I'll let Nick tell you a little more about our plans for next session.
Thanks, Lauren. My name is Nick Hudson. My pronouns are he, him, his. The two other things I want to highlight. The second thing we'll be working on is measures that reduce incarceration and racial disparities. Lauren talked about arrests, but on incarceration and racial disparities, our team has really identified reducing pretrial detention as one of the key ways to accomplish that goal. On any given day in Texas, there are more than 60,000 people in the county or city jails. It's separate from the prison system. And more than 70% of those people have not been convicted. And the vast majority, more than 45,000 people, are simply behind bars because they can't afford a monetary payment. And this, in a country where we pride ourselves on the principles of innocent until proven guilty, the right to an attorney, a speedy trial, punishment that fits the crime, equal justice for all, our pretrial system is really breaking those promises that we've made in our Constitution and laws about what justice is supposed to look like, and it's fueling mass incarceration. So we have an opportunity to make this better, and we've been working with a large coalition of organizations to develop a legislative strategy and a package of proposals that will make our system more safe and just. You'll be hearing more about this, and we'll need your stories, your time, and your support to bring our state closer to a system of fair and equal justice that's promised by our Constitution and laws. The last thing I want to mention is we'll be playing defense. We're going to be defending our progress in Texas. Texas in recent decades has made significant progress decreasing its rate of incarceration, but in a majority of midterm races, we are seeing a surge in tough on crime rhetoric, and we think we are at a tipping point where amid a wave of crime headlines and weaponization of criminal justice issues, we have a choice about whether we're going to move forward towards a more safe and just system or double down on the failures of the 1990s that swept generations of people, disproportionately Black and brown people, into our prisons and jails. And so we anticipate attempts to create new mandatory minimum sentences in next session. We anticipate, as other folks have mentioned, attempts to further criminalize reproductive care and attacks on gender-affirming care. We also anticipate attacks on prosecutorial discretion, the ability of your local prosecutor to make decisions about who gets charged with the crime and who gets a second chance or where the charges are dismissed. So we will be working with our communications team, our legal team, to guard against new tough on crime legislation and further criminalization. Ani, I will pass it back to you.
Hi, everyone. I think Andrew will start it off with an introduction, but my name is Edgar Saldivar, pronouns he, him, and I'm based in the Houston office, although right now I'm in Dallas to give a presentation to lawyers on voting rights, actually. And next week for the election, I will be in Austin to help manage the election protection hotline as part of our voting rights efforts. But I'll pass it to Andrew right now.
Government Relations Coordinator. I'm based out of our Austin office. We're going to start by talking about a few of the problems to solve in this area. Obviously, there are a lot. If you've read the paper at all recently, you've seen some of them. But Edgar's going to get us started with some discussion of voter accessibility.
Sure. So one of the main problems that we've noticed in the state, and that's occurred for a very long time in our state, is the problem of our state legislature making it harder for people to vote as opposed to making it easier. So voter access is a real problem in our state, and that has everything to do from being able to register to vote to actually going to the polls and cast a ballot. Efforts to limit that are something that we're going to tackle, and I'll pass it over to Andrew for a discussion of other problems.
Yeah, so another thing we've seen a lot of recently is increased threats. That according to the Secretary of State's office, a third of Texas election officials have quit in the last 2 years due to some circumstances. So as we see these elections going on, we sort of see this attempt to undermine the faith of those processes by also not only just threatening the electorate itself, but also forcing out those involved in actually administering elections. And yeah, that leads to a lot of decreasing trust in the democratic process. I think that encapsulates really two groups. I think, there's the more obvious one that we've talked about that I think probably comes to mind, which is those voters who believe sort of in the big lies and in the voter fraud and how that can be sort of weaponized by politicians looking to exploit that belief. But it also sort of encapsulates the voters who have lost faith in the democratic process to actually bring about the world that they want to see. Both of those being a huge problem. They lead to both apathy on one side and greater distrust. And those problems, the longer they allow to fester, the more likely they are to just foment that.
Yeah, so additional problems that we are tackling and that we are dealing with in the state is voter suppression, rampant voter suppression. This has been a problem that has increased significantly since 2008 with the election of President Barack Obama. But then after 2013, when the Supreme Court gutted key provisions of the Voting Rights Act, it opened the floodgates to legislatures across the country, and especially in Texas, to implement changes to laws that engage in voter suppression. Everything from strict voter IDs. In Texas, we have the strictest voter ID laws in the country, to efforts to purge the voter rolls. These are just a couple of examples. In addition to that, there are issues with voter intimidation, which can take many forms, from limiting or harassing people who have language needs to misinformation at the polls or about polling locations. All sorts of voter intimidation are things that we will be tackling as well as trying to resolve in our state. And I'll pass it over to Andrew for additional problems.
Yeah, so we've also seen a pretty massive increase in the amount of legislation that's filed and has passed to limit voting by mail here in Texas. We already had a very restrictive system where there are only a very finite number of excuses that allow someone to vote by mail if they're under the age of 65. Despite that, in the last 3 legislative sessions, things have moved that would make it more difficult for people to vote by mail. In the most recent legislative session, there was the implementation of an ID requirement Confusion about that ID requirement, which requires you to include one of two numbers, but doesn't tell you which one is the one that's on file, and leads to ballots being rejected if those numbers don't match. Led to a mail-in ballot rejection rate here in Harris County of 1 in 5. It was about 14% statewide, but here in Harris County it was 1 in every 5 ballots. So obviously a huge issue with making mail-in ballot voting way too complicated, and intentionally so.
Another problem to solve is the disenfranchisement due to gerrymandering, which is the manipulation of electoral districts so that they benefit only a certain group as opposed to others. And this is a real problem in our state, which is actually one of the most diverse states in the country. Just our latest census told us that 95% of the population growth in our state happened in communities of color. So efforts by our state leaders to move the electoral districts around and change the districts through this process called gerrymandering to dilute voter power or to limit the representation of people of color is a real issue that we're tackling on and trying to solve. Which leads us to the next section, which is what does success look like to us? And I'll pass it over to Andrew to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so hopefully a little cheerier here. Let's talk about what success would look like. So first of all, legislation that makes voting easier, working on getting that passed. I think that means two things. One is repealing a lot of the bad laws that have passed in the last couple of years that do make the process more difficult. We're starting in the hole here, right? So we're working towards getting back to where we were, but where we were wasn't that great to begin with. So it also means passing laws that modernize our system, make it easier to register, easier to participate in the process. And for an example of that, back over to Edgar.
Yeah, and we think that one example is having statewide online voter registration. As we're talking about making voting easier and more accessible, this is part of that effort. We think having universal online voter registration is part of that. Success also looks like eradicating suppression while creating accessibility and empowering voters to exercise their rights freely. You're going to see a theme that what we're talking about generally is empowering of voters. Voting, as we all know, is our voice and it leads to power. And so empowering the communities through this right, this fundamental right, is one way that we see success. Pass it over to Andrew.
Yeah, and I would just add to Edgar's point on online voter registration. We're one of only 6 states at this point that does not offer online voter registration. 44 states have gotten this done, so it is not a partisan issue at this point. It is simply an issue of Texas being really at the bottom of the barrel when it comes to accessibility registration. Which leads me into talking a little about, I think success would look like restoring people's faith that voting can actually bring about the world that they want to see. I think ideally voting is, well, I think just to take it back a step, voting is special, and I think, as the theme of tonight, because voting is the right that's preservative of all rights, right? I mean, we don't have our rights in other ways if we don't have our right to vote. So ideally, people would not only believe that their elections are free and fair, but also that their voting preserves their rights and that leads to a government that actually represents their interests. I also would say that, success looks like preventing legislation from passing that would make it easier to overturn elections. There are a lot of forms that this can take. We see, efforts to push election police, separate tribunals for resolving election disputes that are outside of the regular court system. Both of those made it past the Senate last year, the state Senate last year. Due to, advocacy efforts, they did not make it past the House, but we still need to be vigilant about them. Expanding the AG's authority to prosecute criminal cases at the statewide level and taking that away from local actors, and really just, intentionally sowing doubt through audits, investigations, all of these things that remind us that our votes only really matter if they're actually counted. And all of those attempts to sow distrust in the process and to insert partisan actors into the process in those administrative roles really serve as you need to really, work on removing that politicization from the process so that we can have an actually free and fair system that reflects the will of the voters.
And along those lines, success also means preventing the election of actors who would attempt to subvert elections. We've heard of threats of people trying to attempt to change the process of elections or overturn elections. This is something that we see preventing that would be a success. And we also think that depoliticizing the administration of elections so that election officials aren't criminalized for doing their job. And so this leads also to what we think are our goals and how we see us affecting these changes and leading to success. First off, we think that eradicating voter suppression, particularly with respect to communities of colors and voters with disabilities, as well as other historically franchised groups, by decreasing obstacles to participate in election and the criminalization as well as prosecution of those who participate in election. For us, that is a huge goal, and it is an ambitious goal, and I'll have Andrew give an example of that.
Yeah, I think, one of the most concrete examples is just going to be that we're in 2023, 2025, we really want to lead efforts at the legislature to sort of beat back some of the efforts, which I'll talk a little about at the end here, to further suppress the vote, and also to sort of expand that access like we talked about.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, through our efforts in election protection and in litigation and advocacy and public education in general, we think that another goal is to equitably empower voters of color, voters with disabilities, and other historically disenfranchised groups to fully participate in the democratic process so that all of our voices are heard and all of us are part of this shared experiment in our democracy.
And on top of that, in addition to sort of combating traditional voter suppression, we're also looking at election subversion as a big issue that we're facing. This is something I think that we all kind of know and we see, but we don't always have the vocabulary for. But it's all those efforts to sort of encapsulate an idea that we're able to divide out efforts to overturn elections and systematically subvert the will of the people from more traditional efforts to sort of create barriers to participation for specific groups. So everything like inserting into the elections administration process more politicized elements fits into that rubric of election subversion as opposed to sort of simple voter suppression. In terms of what we're expecting during session, just sort of one example of the election subversion narrative that I think we'll see come up. The Court of Criminal Appeals here in Texas found that it was unconstitutional for the AG to engage in the prosecution of election crimes during this interim between the last two sessions. That's something that Attorney General Paxton have fought quite hard, pushed recently to have the case reconsidered. The Court of Criminal Appeals upheld that ruling, but we expect that the legislature will try to come up with some sort of workaround by letting, for example, friendly prosecutors from another jurisdiction, an adjacent jurisdiction, prosecute the case. And what the Court of Criminal Appeals said is that if the Attorney General's help is requested, then they can come back into the prosecution. So I think that's really troubling, just to get a little into the election subversion point. We saw a story just today in the Texas Tribune about 10 investigations that the AG has done of elections officials in the last year. Those investigations led to at least two instances where county party chairs refused to step down on the grounds that the election in question in which they lost their seat, which would have been the March primary, was contested and being investigated by the AG. I think that lays the groundwork for what we all might really fear is coming in 2024, which is if somebody were to try to say that the election results were illegitimate, that would allow someone to step in and say, hey, they're being investigated by the AG currently, and that should be grounds for not certifying the results of an election that should otherwise be certified. So particularly scary for reasons that I think we all know with 2020 in the past, that there are these increased instances of looking at election subversion and refusing to accept election results. Some of the other things we might see this session, it's always a little hard to predict in the voting rights space. Texas is unfortunately a trailblazer when it comes to voter suppression. And so we don't have the guideposts of a lot of other states because we have done it first so many times, which is a sad state of affairs. But I think some of the things that we know might be coming are making it easier to challenge voter registrations. Right now, if you challenge a voter registration, it has to be based on actual knowledge. So there were a lot of registrations that were challenged leading up to this election cycle. None of them were actually scrubbed from the rolls because the person didn't have that actual knowledge or meet that actual knowledge requirement. But repealing that actual knowledge requirement would allow the Secretary of State to be much more aggressive in looking into challenges to voter registrations. Proof of citizenship to register to vote, not something that's currently required. Being litigated in a few other states who have enacted that. It's not something we've done here, but something I think we may see come up here. I already mentioned police and tribunals, some of those attempts to sort of bifurcate the justice system when it comes to election-related crimes. And I'll just end on one more positive note, which is that, you know, we have talked to some more friendly legislators who we expect will be there next session about pushing a good omnibus bill that would sort of lay the groundwork for what an actual good outcome would look like. Give us a lot of ability to say, not only should we not be doing X, but here, look at what we should be doing. That includes things we've already discussed, like online voter registration, but also automatic voter registration, which every time you interact with a government agency that you provide them with enough information to register to vote, that would just be transferred, unless you opted out, automatically over to the voter registrar in your county. That would make the registration rates go through the roof. It would be a huge increase in efficiency, and those are the kind of things we want to be talking about when we're talking about not only do we not want to be doing these things that are going to make it harder for folks to vote, but there are, in fact, a lot of things we could be doing to make it much easier.
Thank you, Edgar. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for ending on a positive note on giving us a little bit of hope for the legislative session and the possibility of an omnibus bill. I wanted to really let that piece sink in. There are possibilities. They all turn back to voting, and that's how we get there. This is why your vote matters in the midterm elections, not just the general. It matters right now, today, tomorrow, on Tuesday. We need you to vote. We need you to remember that your vote matters. We need you to remember that you're a stalwart. That's why you're part of the ACLU of Texas. It's not just you. You should be out there telling and reminding people that they have the right to vote in your family, your friends, your community. We can't do this alone. And every one of us is a part of this next phase for what happens on all of the issues that we discussed tonight. They are all part of the future of our democracy, and they all come back to who we elect right now to make those decisions as representatives in our state, in our counties, in our cities, in our school boards. So with that, and remembering our emphasis on voting, I want to make space for questions now. And our one question that we have is, what does the new Supreme Court mean for free speech? So if we can, I'd like to turn to Kate to help us out in answering that from one of our members. Kate?
Sure, thanks, Ani. So what an interesting question. I think we don't fully know what the new Supreme Court means for free speech, but I'm going to walk you through very briefly, I promise, 3 cases to say sort of why we don't really know. So the first case is the school Snapchat case, let's call it. And this involved a high school teenager who was using an app called Snapchat. I don't know the ages of the people on this call or your relative technical savvy, but my understanding from my younger brother is that Snapchat is an application that you can chat someone and then the snap disappears. So this student was upset because she did not make the cheerleading squad. She sent to some friends some vulgar language about not making the cheerleading squad and about the cheer team. And in a case, in fact, in which she sued, and the ACLU was her lawyer, not ACLU of Texas, but ACLU National and ACLU of Pennsylvania, she prevailed at the Supreme Court in being able to say this language off campus. She had been disciplined by her school, and because she was speaking off campus, that was free speech that the school couldn't discipline. So that was a win for free speech. Second case, much more complicated. So this case involved a high school football coach who was praying after each game at midfield. The high school coach, in the description of the Supreme Court, was engaged in a private prayer at midfield at the end of every football game. Evidence on the record showed that the high school football coach had essentially the entire high school football team gathered around him at midfield at the end of every game. So the coach was disciplined for engaging in what the school decided was a violation of the Establishment Clause, a violation of the constitutional provision that says government can't establish religion. And he said, no, I was engaging in this private activity and I have free speech and free exercise of religion. And the Supreme Court agreed with him. The ACLU strongly disagrees with this decision, and we're very concerned because it doesn't take into account the power dynamics that were at play, and that what was actually occurring on the ground is that the coach was creating a coercive environment in which students of all different faiths and all different belief systems, including atheists, agnostics, students of non-Christian faiths, this was a Christian prayer, wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable participating, but might feel like they had to in order to play on the football team or to start on the football team. So that was very concerning because it was the court ruling for free speech, but in a way that failed to recognize how the school district was essentially establishing religion and not taking into account the power dynamics at play. And then the third case, briefly, was a case in which the ACLU also was involved, the ACLU and the ACLU of Louisiana. And this is a case called Doe versus McKesson. In this case, the Supreme Court essentially punted. And this case involved a Black Lives Matter protest organized in part by activist DeRay McKesson. And in the course of this protest, allegedly a person participating in the protest threw a rock. Now, there's really well-established law that protects free speech and protects organizing protests, and that says that leaders of protests can't be liable for the violent acts of a person who happens to be participating in a protest unless they specifically intended or personally authorized the violence. Nevertheless, the Fifth Circuit, which is the Court of Appeals for Texas as well as Louisiana, said that Mr. McKesson could be liable. And then the Supreme Court said, well, before we really evaluate this question and evaluate the First Amendment question of whether that violates free speech to hold someone liable for a rock thrown at a protest by a third party where there wasn't intent to encourage violence in any way, we're going to kick this back to the state of Louisiana to figure out some questions of state law wrapped up in the case. And that case has not come back before the Supreme Court. It's still percolating in Louisiana, to my knowledge. But it is troubling because you would hope that the Supreme Court would reach the constitutional question and would strongly stand up for the rights of protesters and organizers of protests. And that's another example where the Supreme Court seems not to have taken into account the sort of structural concerns underlying free speech and who gets to speak and how to ensure that there's a wide range of speech free from coercion. So I would say that the jury's still out on where the Supreme Court stands on free speech. These are not encouraging signs. There hasn't been a huge free speech case. And then the last thing to remember is that the Supreme Court is not everything, right? So even just in the legal sphere, most cases don't get to the Supreme Court. Most cases stop in federal court at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which, for example, in the McKesson case, had a ruling that was really outrageous and has often been anti sort of free speech in contexts, but not always in contexts that involve sort of these structural concerns that we've been discussing. And then the final thing is that free speech is also not just about the courts, right? And it's really important that we all cultivate a culture of free speech and a culture in which people feel comfortable expressing their views, and a culture free from intimidation. And I think that's something that, as we talked about sort of the other issues tonight, and voter intimidation, and a concern that particularly for people from marginalized communities, being able to speak free from intimidation is really under threat in this country more than it has been in certainly the past 10 or 15 years.
Thank you, Kate. I really appreciate you taking time to go through that answer, a really important one for our team. As we think about the future, I want to add one note for people who are listening in tonight. We've focused a lot on voting, and I want to be very clear that voting is not the only aspect of a democratic government or the only way to engage with it. You can show up to everything from being a part of a hearing to being in front of your city council or in front of your school board meeting. There are a plethora of ways to engage in the democracy, and all of them are important. But on this day, with the upcoming election, I want to especially remind people of the urgency and importance of voting. And that's not to say that the other things don't matter, but to emphasize that's what's on the horizon right now. I want to thank everyone for being a part of this meeting, from our staff and all of our partners to help make this evening possible, our board and our board chair, Ranjana, and all of you. We're very grateful to have you here. We're thankful for your time and support, and I want to leave you with 3 things. Vote, educate, donate. First, as I said earlier, vote. Make sure that you make a plan to vote if you haven't already, and that you don't do it alone, that you remind other people to go and vote as well. Second, educate. Stay tuned. Follow us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, follow us on any social media platform. Tune in and listen to our events or show up in person to our events or come out and check what's on our website. You can sign up for our email alerts and notifications there. Stay apprised of what's happening in all of these spaces and allow us to share what we're doing, how we're making an impact, and how you can get involved. And then finally, donate. We can't do this work without your help. You can make a non-taxable donation to our 501c4, or you can make a tax-deductible donation to our 501c3. And you can do so on our website on the donate link. That's at www.aclutx.org/donate. Thank you all for tuning in and for being here in person. We are so grateful for you. Have a good night. Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.